Hi everyone and welcome to this video. In this video we'll talk about the archetype of the trickster. The trickster archetype is a very interesting archetype because it does occur or reveal itself in a lot of products of the psyche, a lot of pop culture especially, which we'll mention a little bit, go into a little bit, but it's also an archetype that sort of acts as an entry point into what we would call the collective unconscious, and thus acts as sort of a trigger, trickster trigger, of the development of consciousness on the process or on the path of individuation. So let's get right into it. First, we'll have to sort of briefly give an introduction of Jung's architecture of the psyche so you can follow along the explorations that we'll venture into. We'll talk about the trickster and products of the psyche and the characteristics of these characters in brief terms. We'll talk about the trickster in a context, so sort of the trickster and sort of what characterizes it in Jung's view. And we'll talk about, finally, the trickster in everyday life. So in your own sort of life, what can the trickster offer you and what can it do for you in everyday life? Now, introductory notes first. Oh, before I forget it, please do consider to subscribe to the channel, and what is very important to me, more important than a subscription, I guess, is that you leave a comment below, because it's important to me to have a reflection what you think about this content and what you think I should produce and go into more depth on. So without further ado, let's go into the introduction to this video. So Carl Jung, psychoanalyst, Carl Jung worked at the turn of the 20th century in Switzerland and developed a theory of the psyche that sort of goes beyond our classical understandings of it. He developed beyond sort of the ego, which is the subjective core of the psyche, and the personal unconscious, which is sort of the shadow that the ego casts, if you will. So the kind of repressed memories that which the ego doesn't want to integrate in the story it has about itself. He developed a concept that he referred to as the collective unconscious. And this collective unconscious is interesting because it is essentially the sort of the ground, the fundament of reality from which everything else arises. Now, as this fundament, the collective unconscious is essentially forms the trajectories, or provides us with the trajectories along which the elements that we encounter in everyday life can be assembled. As that, if you want to understand this further, do go check out my other videos. I don't want this to become an exhaustively long video, so I'll just brush over it. But as you can see, the collective unconscious here is a space that is determinant of a lot of the sort of structure that we experience within our own lives. The collective unconscious, again, allows us or determines the path in which we can unfold our own understanding of reality. Now, it doesn't mean that the collective unconscious is sort of a strict and rigid structure that cannot be shaped. That's, I think, a wrong interpretation of Jung. The collective unconscious does change, and the trickster archetype highlights this quite nicely. But the collective unconscious is always something that comes before us as already there, right? And then we have to inhabit this sort of hero archetype, of which the trickster certainly can be an aspect, and in order to develop the structure further. Now, what is an archetype then? An archetype is one of these sort of nuclei of the collective unconscious, so one of these trajectories. Now, the trickster archetype in particular is let's say, what I would call a functional archetype. So it's essentially something that it's a function because it is something that we witness occurring over and over and over again. Now, there are what I would call relational archetypes, and they're functional as well, but relational archetypes that are more related to, let's say, the relationship to our parents, the relationship to certain people. But the trickster archetype can also fall into this category to some extent because it is essentially, as we'll come to see, that which prompts us to go against the grain. So prompts us to go against that which we think. It embodies chaos, disruption, and creativity. And there's sort of, let's say, it pushes us over the line. It is that which continuously highlights, let's say, that which we don't want to hear, annoying us almost to a point that we have to look. Now, in order to understand this function, we have to go a little more into depth on the relationship of the ego to the collective unconscious in particular, but also the personal unconscious. And this relationship is one of denial to some extent. The ego is essentially concerned with maintaining the stability of its own structure. So the ego builds an interpretation, a sort of narrative that I propose. It's a narrative. You can again see my reasoning in other videos. But this narrative is essentially a crystallized view of the elements that it encounters. So the ego essentially thinks, okay, well, the world is nice and predictable, and I want to just go through this world and sort of live a life in calmness and stability. But then there's all this sort of weird noise that comes in from the personal unconscious in the form of desires and so on, and from the collective unconscious in the form of sort of this push to realize, to move towards sort of the non-ego. And of course, there's also the encounter with reality, which is sort of always highlights that the interpretations of the ego are essentially wrong, right? You know, I always give this example: if you interpret someone to be stable, you couldn't be more false. You know, like, people are not stable; they change all the time. Now, the trickster archetype comes into play to precisely highlight this sort of difference, right? This difference between an ego that you think is stable and the actual development of this ego over time. Now, what is important here to highlight is that the archetype that we then call the trickster is essentially an archetypal image. Now, if we talk about, you know, in a minute, we talk about Prometheus, we talk about Jack Sparrow as an example, those are archetypal images. They're not so much the archetype itself. The archetype itself is, again, as I said, an empty sort of function. It is something that, you know, the recurrence of something springing up from the unconscious, prompting the ego to look towards something that it doesn't want to look towards. That is sort of, in a condensed version, I suppose, what the trickster is attempting to highlight. And that has occurred over and over again. That's why, in the human history, that's why we would call it the trickster archetype. Now, let's get into products of the psyche concerning the trickster. Now, what is the product of the psyche? For Jung, a product of the psyche is essentially a something that has been developed by humans as a reflection, or Jung then says, something that has been developed by humans is always developed as a reflection of human dealing with, let's say, the world around us. And the world around us is also sort of then considered to include the world that we would usually consider to be within. So it's also sort of your inner workings. Essentially, the products of the psyche are orientational attempts of the ego in the world. That's why they're developed. And this could be dreams, this could be fairy tales, it could be movies, it could be paintings, it could be mythology, it could be rituals. But you know, we'll talk about two very particular products of the psyche here to highlight sort of the function of the trickster, and that is Prometheus and Jack Sparrow. Now, you see, Prometheus essentially, this idea that Prometheus as the bringer of the light, he steals a flame from in a certain moment of let's say tyranny, the attempt to protect this flame, right, to keep it within a certain space, is again akin to the attempt of the ego to maintain control of its own sort of, let's say, control of reality. So to maintain control of reality, which the trickster certainly, or Prometheus in this case, takes away, highlighting this function of, oh well, no, I can precisely do the opposite. I will take this away because you don't have control. And I think this is what Jack Sparrow in many cases, and I'll make videos going into more depth on Jack Sparrow, especially because I think it's a great example. But just to briefly mention it, Jack Sparrow has precisely this attitude, right? Jack Sparrow is not the main figure, the main character in the movies, but that would be William and his struggle sort of with Elizabeth. And Jack Sparrow always only functions as this sort of this rupturing force, this force that comes in and sometimes in the right moments, sometimes in the wrong moments, sort of brings precisely the disruption and chaos that the trickster archetype brings to the table. Now, the characteristic of the trickster are considered selfish and immoral. Selfish precisely because there's an unfiltered view of the world that the trickster embodies, and he is, and precisely because he's less manipulated by conscious constructs on the level of the ego, often being influenced by sort of this persona which sits at the top, if you will, of the ego, and thus influenced by sort of societal expectations. The trickster is not influenced by that because he precisely ventures between the lines of, let's say, the unconscious and consciousness. Now, the trickster also is unconcerned and spontaneous. He often lacks neuroticism. He often gets lucky precisely because he is, let's say, in line with the rhythms in some points. Now, this is of course a healthy trickster function, an archetypal trickster function. Of course, people that embody this archetype in everyday life, let's say someone like Jack Sparrow as a movie character, but also people that embody sort of this trickster archetypes. There's a specific personality type in the Jungian context to embody this archetype. They're often clouded, with all sorts of traumas, and thus may not fulfill these entirely. But the trickster in this archetypal function is a catalyst of change, a spontaneous force that again ruptures the stability of an existent structure. Now, Mercury as a metal, right? Again, like Prometheus in the context of the alchemical quest, is a force of change. It's the crosser of boundaries, the mediator, again, the mediator between the realms. Mercury functioning as sort of the escaping metal, so the metal that escapes from sort of one realm into the other, extracting gold from gold ore. Now, there is sort of the idea of the trickster in Christianity, where the trickster is to some extent condemned in the Christian mythology, right? Almost, right? There is a sort of here, and I can talk about this in more detail in other videos, but there's the idea of the trickster almost being sort of non-existent or having no place within the realm of Christian mythology. In Gnosticism, that's quite different, but we'll talk about that in other videos. There is a characterization of Yahweh in the Old Testament as a trickster figure, indeed, in some interpretations, which is quite interesting again, because if you think about sort of the connection between the snake in the paradise, so the devil in paradise, essentially, in the snake that prompts the development of consciousness, that prompts Adam and Eve to sort of see, and the connection of that to sort of Yahweh that intervenes sort of at random as it appears in the Old Testament, as a sort of moody, chaotic force almost. You have an interesting line of thought going on there, but again, we'll talk about this, and this of course is a Gnostic level, Gnostic line of thought, but we'll talk about that in other videos in more detail. Now let's get to a sort of a little more detailed understanding of the trickster in context. So first of all, the trickster, as I mentioned, is a boundary crosser, right? The trickster lives outside of hierarchies and attempts to destroy those hierarchies, precisely because he moves against sort of this interpretive framework of the ego, right? The trickster is always sort of that which attempts to go against the grain, disturbs sort of what we would call the divine order, which would be not really the divine order in the context of the ego. It would more be a disturbance of the subjective structure to move perhaps towards a more objective structure. But what is very important is that this movement is not purposeful by the trickster, right? The trickster doesn't really intend this movement. He's simply a force of destruction to some extent. And by that force, you see this in Jack Sparrow's compass a little bit. By virtue of that destruction, he submits himself entirely to some extent to arbitration. And the compass in this as a symbolic gesture would symbolize the submission to these forces and these possible sort of sources of resonance. The trickster often acts selfish because he lets himself be driven by a sort of what Freud would call the libido, which is sort of these natural, almost instinctual forces, which for Jung would be sort of archetypal sources, which is why he acts as a door opener into that space. The trickster often twists reality for his purpose. He often reveals, again, as I said, uncomfortable truths, which is simply, again, this force that sort of goes against this interpretation, this interpretive framework of the ego. An uncomfortable truth in the end is nothing else but that which is not considered to have a place within the space that you have sort of created for yourself. The trickster is sort of close, for Jung, the trickster is close to the sort of divine animal human nature, which is sort of close to this instinctual level. Again, not having such a strong force of consciousness. That's why characters with sort of a trickster personality often they're unpredictable. They don't do well within contexts where predictability is required, job context and so on. And their motives are often difficult to understand and follow. Now, what does this mean for our everyday lives, and how does the trickster how can we leverage this? Now, one element may be that you know someone that has a trickster, sort of more of a trickster function that lives out this trickster function. This may be someone that has opposing beliefs to you, and for that reason, appears to you to live out this function, right? This doesn't have to be someone that sort of is necessarily in every context living out this trickster function, this trickster personality, but you may as well also know someone. It's in the Myers-Briggs test, it's the ENTP function, and that is commonly associated with this trickster personality type. Now, children are also considered to be living closer to this trickster function in the phylogenetic development, because they don't have this set conscious structure yet. They're testing boundaries. Their interaction with the world is based on sort of precisely this boundary testing, based on lying, based on provocative actions, and precisely because of that, tricksters children can function as tricksters for adults, especially their parents. However, that sort of transitions then with the development, the first phase of individuation that we've established in other videos. Children then continue to develop into a more solid and strong ego, and then again need those, or require to some extent, those that remain more in this childish space, remain more in this trickster archetype space, to help them sort of, let's say, uncover the path towards the unconscious. Now, trickster is also revealed often in humor or missteps, sort of day-to-day mischief and unconscious actions, perhaps also even in desires, although the desires I'd always be careful with, because those may be driven simply by the person unconscious. But often you have a depiction as gestures, and truth often is revealed here also in the humor. So comedians, all these sort of and again the joke as an access point to the unconscious. There's a great essay by Freud entitled precisely as that. If we can't deal with something, we'll usually joke about it or negate it. So you often see sort of in negations and sort of jokes, you see access points into sort of realities that you can't admit to yourself. Now, the trickster is always sort of to be found in the response that we utter to sort of ego tyranny. So you may respond to this defensively, you may respond to it humorously, you may sort of rupture it. If someone constantly highlights your tyrannical sort of tendencies in certain contexts, goes against grain, argues against you, let's say, you may be able to see this trickster function enacted in this certain moment. Now, in conclusion, what we can sort of take from this, I think, this very brief introduction, is that the trickster it's an interesting archetype, an archetype that sort of certainly reveals a pathway into the unconscious, a little different from sort of the animos that reveal pathways into the unconscious, but similarly, the trickster sort of moves beyond the realm, moves through the realms, not in the way that the hero moves through the realms, because the hero moves through the realms carrying something with him, using the trickster as sort of just another stepping stone on his journey, while the trickster is precisely concerned with this journey and for the sake of the rupture itself. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, then please do leave a like and let me know in the comments what you think about this. And if you want further readings on the trickster, then consider to click the link in the description where you can find or you can send a request for me to send you a reading list of Jung. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.